Hi, and welcome to the MusiShare Young Artist Program Series, ViewPoint. Today, I have the honor and pleasure to talk with Bruce Dukov. Bruce is someone I've known for a long time, and he's a native New Yorker. He was trained at the Juilliard School of Music, where he studied with the renowned Dorothy DeLay. Among his numerous awards, he received a U.S. government Fulbright Grant for overseas study in England, the Kosciusko Foundation Wieniawski Prize, and first prize in the 1973 National Young Artist Competition in America. In 1974, he settled in London, where he performed in famous halls such as the Concertgebouw and recorded radio recitals for most of the major BBC stations in England, Scotland, Wales, RTE England, AVRO Holland, NDR Germany, NRK Norway, and Istanbul radio. His television appearances were also frequent in England on BBC One, 2, LWT, Thames TV, and Yorkshire TV. Returning to America to live in 1985, Bruce chose to settle in Los Angeles, which offered him the perfect opportunity to participate in the studio recording industry, where he is highly sought as concertmaster. To date, he has recorded in over 1,850 feature motion picture soundtracks. That's quite a large number, Bruce. Welcome to ViewPoint. So, listen, with that in mind, what do you consider the most difficult part of recording in the studios?
All right, well, what happens in the studio is it draws on a number of skill sets that you really have to develop to a very high level in order to function properly in the studio. Because for the most part, you're sight reading. You're not given the music in advance. You know, when you're in an orchestra which plays either standard repertory or new music, at least they give you the music beforehand to prepare. So in the first rehearsal, everybody knows what they're going to be playing and they play it. In the studios, we don't have that advantage. You come in and the music is there and you're seeing it for the first time. And you have to be very, very rhythmically secure. You have to have a great ability to look at the music, understand the complex rhythms. If there are, complicated rhythms to be played, you have to be able to catch it right away. You have to have a very, very strong sense of the beat. Although we all wear what's called a click, we have a little headphone with a, metronome going on all the time, which is our God, seriously. Because sometimes you have a conductor who thinks he's conducting us, but really we're just listening to And if he screws up, he goes, "Oh no, I have to do that again. I screwed up." I always say to him, "No, yeah, but nobody can hear you." But the point is that it is important to have a conductor, because when it is complicated and the rhythm and the meters change, like 5/4, 3/4, 2/4, sometimes you do need to see where the downbeat is to know where you are in the music. But so that's the second thing. You have to be very strong sense of keeping the tempo without rushing or lagging behind. And then you have to have a super secure left hand to be able to find notes that, as I say, you haven't practiced the part, so you have to be able to sight read and know when you have to hit a high A that you're going to be able to just hit it without,
Yeah, a lot of these parts aren't written necessarily with the violinist hand in mind.
Exactly, right. And so nothing is done. Well, very few composers actually take that into account. They use their musical sense of what they want to impart to the score. And if there's a run that's a very difficult run for the violin, sometimes it's more of an effect rather than you're worried about the accuracy of how you're going to play it. It's sort of like in Die Valkyrie, a lot of people, if you had to play individually and hear everybody playing separately, you'd go nuts, because not everybody's playing every note and everything that's happening there. So, I mean, there will be some people that are, but not every single bar is going to be perfect. But as a whole group of 26 violins, say, or 30 violins, it's a blend, and it all gives the effect of this incredible tornado going on.
Has it ever occurred that you've gone to a conductor or someone and said, perhaps if there were an A sharp rather than a B.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. You know, enharmonics it's a real skill set for the music copyists because sometimes they have to understand they're reading vertically for what the composer's intent is with the chord. So if, let's say the key is F sharp major, right?
Right.
And uh, they're writing the F sharp because it's in the key of what he's done. But in our run, that happens to be happening. A G flat might be more useful for us sight reading wise, or vice versa. Usually it's the other way around. We don't like the flats, we like the sharps, you know, as violinists. But I just wanted to go back a second about the sight reading part, because when I started off in the studios, which was back in 1977 in London, and going way right through to the early 90s here, most of the music was handwritten by a very skilled group of copyists who, for the most part, were writing very neatly, but hand copied parts. You know, there wasn't the digital printing that we have now.
Right.
And so you just prayed that you had a good copyist, because many times you had some people that were a little sloppy and their ledger lines were like little semicircles. So sometimes a three ledger line F would be higher than a four ledger line A, you know. It's very frustrating. But then there was the advent of Finale, which is a music program, and Sibelius and Encore. These are programs where you can print the music and it comes out like it's engraved, you know. And you have choices of, you could even have a hand font that looks like somebody's handwritten it, which I don't like. But anyway, you have good music to read from. But you still have to come in and sight read the parts. But now, in the past 3 years, I would say, the copyists have become very, very kind to us, and they make PDF copies of the music that they copied, and they can post it online a day or two before sometimes. So we have access sometimes to look at the music before we're going to play it, if you have the time to look at it or the inclination to. Sometimes I like the challenge because I'm old school. I look at the gray hair. I'm old school. I like the challenge of coming in and sight reading. So I think that's just my MO. I enjoy that, the adrenaline rush.
Huh. So, okay, all of what you're doing right now had to start somewhere, and I know you studied with Miss DeLay, as we were in Juilliard and Aspen around the same time. But who came before? Who was the teacher? How did you start with the violin?
Okay, it's an interesting, not really interesting, but you're asking me, so I'll tell you. I grew up in a very musical family, actually. My father was a violinist, and my mother was a fantastic accordion player and pianist. Now, in the 1950s, I'm a child of the 50s, and it was a golden era, you know. And it's just, when you think about it, there was a farm at the end of my street, and I lived in Queens. I mean, it was very rural. I was in an area called Kew Gardens Hills, which is in between Kew Gardens and Forest Hills. But there was one postal district called Flushing in those days, and Flushing encompassed the whole group of those towns. Anyway, at the end of my street, 70th Avenue, there was a farm with cows. I remember growing up with that. I mean, then, of course, the 10 years into the 50s, everything was thrown down, and they started building apartment buildings, and now it's unrecognizable. I've gone back a couple of times to look at it. So anyway, it was a very musical, and my mother was an accordionist, as I said, which was a hugely popular instrument in the 1950s. So she was a very, very busy teacher. We had a studio in the house where she would be teaching. And she and my father had a musical duo that toured all over the world. And she did these great arrangements of classical pieces like Romanian Rhapsody and or Carmen and all this kind of stuff, and then also popular tunes. And my father was a very natural violinist. He had to leave home at a very young age. He had an abusive father. And this is in the Depression era now, I'm talking 1920s.
Yeah.
So he had a hard life, and he never really was able to go to a conservatory, but he had a tremendous natural talent on the violin. So he and my mother, they met up when they were like in their late teens, and they fell in love, and they became this duo. And through the 1940s, they toured and did all this fantastic stuff. And then when the children, myself and my sister, were born, my mother realized that it wasn't a life for us to have the parents touring around all the time. They wanted to have something secure to be in the area where their family was. And we had a large family in New York City. So my mother figured out that she'd be teaching, and then on the weekends, she and my father would go do their gigs, you know, and sometimes they would drive as far as Cleveland, Ohio, and, you know, and go to different areas, but they would be doing this stuff on the weekends only. And then when the summer times, we had a house up in the Catskill Mountains where my parents were really big in the Borscht Belt. And they went around, you know, Grossinger's and the Concord Hotel and all these other big areas, and there was so many of them. And they would entertain every weekend. And my father would get up at 4 in the morning on Monday and drive back to his day job, which he had at Eastman Kodak. That's another story. But anyway, the point was that my father was a violinist, and I grew up in a household with a lot of violin music going on. So naturally, I wanted to play the violin. But I was a cut-up kid, and I probably had what they call ADHD now, but they didn't diagnose it in those days. I couldn't sit still. My mother used to call me Mr. Fidgets. At the table, you know. So I think she read the room with me pretty well, that I wasn't going to, if they started me at 5 or 6 on the violin, I wasn't going to take to it. But I had a toy violin that I was playing all the time, and they saw that I had some ability. On my 8th birthday, they started. So I started at age 8, and I went to a place called the Henry Street Settlement down in the Lower East Side, which my father attended when he was a child.
Wow.
Wow, yeah. So 30 years later, there I am in the Henry Street Settlement. And I had an old Hungarian teacher who was very, very based on, you know, from Ali's scales and all that kind of stuff. And that's how I learned to play. And in the first year or two, I made tremendous progress. I'm not saying I was a prodigy by any standards, but I made good progress, and I was playing, you know, impressively well for a 10-year-old maybe. Not on today's standards. Oh my God. I saw the 7-year-old Japanese girl playing the other day, and I was just completely like, this is impossible. How is she 7 years old and playing this way? 7 years old. I remember Sarah Chang at 8 playing the Paganini Soreikidens, thinking this is impossible. But this kid was 7, a Japanese girl, with the most incredible poise and natural ability. It's astounding. Anyway, so I was 10, and my father was a hi-fi fanatic, and every couple of years he'd buy another tape recorder. You know, he had these big giant, he had Marantz and a Macintosh amplifier and all this, you know, the aficionado stuff. And every couple of years he'd want to change his recorder because they kept coming out with better models. So one year he gave me one of his old tape recorders. And I thought, what if I record myself playing the violin for 10 minutes and then just keep playing it back? And my grandmother, who lived with us at the time, while my mother was teaching in the studio, when I came home from school and I was supposed to practice for an hour, I'd sit up in the room and play my tape recorder and sit and read Mad Magazine. Until one day she came up and thought, oh, Bruce is practicing really well. She opens the door, here's the violin, and there's no Bruce. I'm in the bathroom, you know. So, I mean, I was fooling myself. I could have easily made some great progress, and I didn't. And then the next year, the Beatles came out. And that was it. First of all, I wasn't cool at school for playing the violin, but I taught myself the guitar. Right. Yeah. And I taught myself the guitar, and because of the theory training that I had to have, of course, in Henry Street Settlement, I went to theory class, which was actually, it was agony while I was doing it, but man, it did me a great service for later in life. Because of my own arrangements and things that I did, the harmonic understanding of chord progressions and things like that, it really did help.
Wow.
But also it helped me because I was able to listen to the Beatles music and analyze the chords and know what they were playing. And because of the dexterity that I had from the violin, I was able to move around on the guitar fairly well. So I became like a lead guitarist. And all these little fledgling groups wanted me to be their lead guitarist. So for 2 or 3 years, until I was 13 maybe, I never practiced the violin. I'd go for a weekly lesson. I'd do the old sight read, the lesson stuff. And the teacher would tell my father, and he'd be tearing his hair out, and she'd be tearing his, he could be so talented. And I just didn't make any progress. But I was cool in school. But I still, by osmosis, I guess, still developed on the violin. Not very well. And then when I was 15, it was time for high school. And my mother realized that if I stayed in the area in Queens with the kids that were my peers, you know, at the time, I'd probably end up being a grocery clerk and not develop any skills on the violin or anything like that. And there's a high school of music and art in New York City. That was a school that they loosely based the movie Fame back in the 80s on.
Exactly.
And now it actually is that way, the school. It's the LaGuardia School of the Arts and Lincoln Center. And it encompasses dance and art and music. In those days, this was music and art, and there was a separate school downtown named Performing Arts. That was a sister school of dance. Anyway, so I went to music and art, and that changed my life. Because I was all of a sudden better than most of the other kids. I wasn't still very good, but I was better than most of the other kids in the school. Now, mind you, the school still had some great stars. I mean, the first year I came in there, Joel Smirnoff, who became the first violinist at the Juilliard School, he was the concertmaster of the senior orchestra. And Bobby Zelnick was his stand partner. Remember Bobby Zelnick?
Yeah.
And the DeLay, very big talent. And then Gene Drucker was sitting behind him. And Eugene, of course, from the Emerson.
From the Emerson.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was principal second. I remember that. And then the next year, Eugene was concertmaster of the senior orchestra. And I was sitting behind him. And then the next year, when I was senior, I was concertmaster of the senior orchestra. And they gave me the Rondo Capriccioso to play as a solo. And that's when I realized I could actually be a violinist, because I was playing that piece on a level of, basically anybody playing it out there. Not the great artists, not on that level, but certainly technically on the level. So DeLay, who I just had started to study with.
How'd that happen? How did you meet her?
Well, I went to a music camp called Red Fox. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was in New Marlborough, Massachusetts. And the owner of the camp, Isabel Sant'Ambrogio, whose son, John Sant'Ambrogio, was a cellist in the Boston Symphony, who is the father of Sarah Sant'Ambrogio, who's a fabulous cellist. And I wrote an arrangement of the Stars and Stripes for their trio, the Eroica Trio. And when they perform it, Sarah makes a little announcement like this, the arranger of this piece for us has seen me naked. Yeah, because I remember her as a little baby crawling around naked in the...
Yeah.
It was cute.
That's cool.
Anyway, so I went to this music camp, and it was a wonderful camp because they had all the principal players from the Boston Symphony. Johnny would ask them to come out and run out the concerto before they play it there. So we had Jules Eskin, who was the principal cellist. He came and ran the Saint-Saëns concerto with us. We had Joey Silverstein, who came and played the Brahms with us. We had Roger Charmant, who was a great violinist in the section there, played the Beethoven with us. I mean, when I say with us, I was in the orchestra at Red Fox. And there was a girl named Barbara Gersh who was talking about this woman named Miss DeLay. And she was saying, Miss DeLay this, and Miss DeLay that, and she's really, brilliant. She teaches so well. And I was thinking, what's so wonderful about her? Well, have you ever heard of this guy, Itzhak Perlman? I said, yes, of course, because he had just won the Levin trip or whatever at that time. And she said, she's his teacher. I said, no, I thought he studied with Galamian, who was famous. And she said, yes, he does, but she's really his teacher. She sees him all the time, and which is, you and I know the truth of that, right? She was like with him every minute. And she was in the shadow of Galamian, and that's one of the reasons she finally split, because she was always pushed down and not given the credit.
Exactly.
So she taught me about it, and I was studying with the conductor of the orchestra in Red Fox at the time. His name was Jules Hedgie. He was a very fine violinist, Jules, and also a conductor, and a very keen chamber musician and a very good sense of humor. He was a good guy. And he opened my eyes up to the Flesch violin system of scale system. And he said, when you master this system, everything is written out for you in every key and every sort of possibility of what you're going to be doing on the violin. He says, you master that system, and it's going to be amazing for you. I started thinking, wow, these double harmonics and tenths and everything's written out already for me. I don't have to think about figuring it out myself.
Just think about how to do it.
I asked him, do you ever hear this woman, Dorothy DeLay? And he said, yes, of course I've heard of her. I said, well, I'm thinking, would it be a good idea for me to study with her? He says, I think it'd be wonderful for you. I said, I need a letter of recommendation to write for the pre-college division to get in. So he wrote me this letter, and I got into the pre-college division, which was a year before or two before I went to the main school. Started to study with her. She was wonderful. You know how kind and sweet she was. And I didn't understand a thing she was telling me. Oh, parallel to the, I mean, I was a natural violinist, but I had no idea what the hell she's talking about. Oh, parallel to the bridge and the finger up like this on the bow. And she's so patient and so kind, and she would talk about the sounding point and everything. And I started understanding it. But I entered Juilliard there as the real low man on the totem pole, because there were people like, and Bobby Zelnick, for example, or Arturo Del Moni. You know, these guys were like, wow, unbelievable players. And I was like, I don't even know how they do what they're doing. But I started to get it in my head. And my first year of Juilliard was a tough year, and my mother passed away, which was very sad at the end of May 1970. And just at that time, a teacher who I'd studied with in a previous summer at Blue Hill, I went to Kneisel Hall at Blue Hill, and there was I didn't actually study with him, but he was one of the artists in residence there named Charles Traeger. Now, this man was not only just a great violinist, but he was a really cool guy. He was a fun man, a lot of, you know, he just was a very entertaining person, but he also was excited about the violin, and he was just so wonderful. He was the first American to win the Wieniawski Prize in Poland. There'd never been an American before that. And he recognized some ability that I had, although I didn't study with him that summer. And he became the solo violinist for the Lincoln Center Chamber Music Society, which had just been formed in 1969-70. And they were performing at Tully Hall all the time. And so I would sneak in and see them and go backstage and see Charles. When he approached me in May, just after my mother died, actually, and he said, I've got an opportunity to take a violinist out with me on full scholarship to Aspen. Would you like to come? And I was all set to go to Meadowmount that summer, I think. And of course, that was not on scholarship. And I said, you know what, I'm going to talk to my father and see how I feel about it. And he was all behind me. And that summer of 1970 revolutionized my entire violin playing and career. Charles Traeger is responsible for actually making me understand how to play the violin without being tied up in knots of pushing my arm in and out, looking with the bow parallel to the bridge. And the golden words that he said to me were, of course, anybody listening to this, it's going to be important that you understand what the words are, but you have to also understand what a sound on a violin should sound like, because otherwise the words are meaningless. He said, the ear is the lowest common denominator. Listen with your ear, and if you're making the right sound on the violin, the tone that you want to create, you'll be doing the right things, and don't worry about the physical action that's causing it. Golden, right? Because
totally.
If you're thinking, it's like, what is the word? When people actually, you have a pain in your shoulder, and somebody gives you some ointment to rub on it, okay, it's rubbing and it's taking some of the pain away, but it's not curing what's causing the pain in your shoulder. You have to find out what the originating pain is in there, right? So in a way, the bad sound I was making, whatever it was, I was so tied up in knots trying to figure out if my bow is parallel to the bridge and if my fingers are in the right position and my pinky's doing this and everything, that I didn't realize if I just listened to the sound I'm creating. And as I said, the main point is that you have to know what a good sound on the violin is. You have to understand that in your head. And when you hear it, you'll automatically be doing the right things, which is why the great violinists like Milstein or the other people, they were doing unorthodox things, but it all sounded great. Yeah. Just because of what the sound is. So recognizing what the right sound is will make you do the right things as you play.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Okay. And I'm sure you've heard this question thousands of times.
Okay.
Okay?
I can't wait to hear this question.
You're a young violinist, and you've come to LA, and you want to just make it and do the studios.
Okay. All right. That's a very good question. Now, because here's an example of something. And I was very, very lucky because I had the experience in England already. There's something about the studio scene, particularly in New York and in Los Angeles, but Los Angeles I can speak to with more knowledge. It's a very, especially when I moved here in the 80s, it's a very closed-in business, and people are very, very protective of their positions in it, because it is, after all, freelance. So there's no contract, there's no guarantee that you're going to be called for something. And in the days when I came in here, there was a kind of an old good boy network, you know, with your friend who you'd like to have in there, whether they were really good or not, but they were your friend, or they gave you work. For, you know, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your kind of thing. Oh, getting back to asking what it's like to first come into place. Now, I had the advantage of, in England, having the 8 or 9 years that I was there in the studios, learning how to play in the studios. I was not good at it in the beginning because, and I'm so embarrassed about this, oh God, I was a noodler. Noodler is the worst thing you could do when you're in the studios. Actually, the worst thing you could do in an orchestra. It's playing your solos loud and doing them to show off how good you are. You're playing passages and everything. It has nothing to do with the music you're going to be playing in the studio, but just practicing. You know, when you're warming up and you're practicing, nobody really wants to hear you do that. Either you're rubbing their nose and you're playing and saying, look how great I am, or you're just obnoxious. I was both of those. I was so embarrassed, so mortified that I was like that. And it was only to the credit of my friend who stood staunchly behind me and said, oh, I love to hear him play. Let him play. He was the head of the session. He said, no, come on, I want to hear him. Play that passage again. I want to see how you did that. You know, but it was wrong because it was encouraging. I learned, don't do it. There's a cute couple of guys on the internet called Two Set Violin. I don't know if you ever heard of them. Right. They have one thing about noodling. I think one of their episodes is about, you know, showing off or playing. It's a big no-no. So to anybody listening out there and thinking of going into the studios or any situation, even orchestra, don't play. Don't play. Practice a passage in the music you're going to be playing and do it softly. But don't noodle and be disruptive. It's not a good thing. I'm lucky I survived it, but I don't think many people can.
Okay.
When I moved to LA, let me just explain something to you. I already set up in advance because Glenn Dictorow, you know as well.
Yeah.
When I played, you know, I did that birthday variations in the style of Paganini for 2 violins, which I played for Milstein's birthday in New York in 1983. Yeah. And Glenn was there, and he asked me, what am I doing in London? Why am I wasting my time there? He said, go out to LA, you can become one of the #1 guys. And I was already fed up with the money in England and the high taxation and the weather. And I said to the composers, I already mentioned this earlier in the interview just now, about could you ask for me if I moved to LA? Exactly. And there were a few, like as I said, Bruce Broughton, and then Bill Conti was another, and John Barry. And there was a number of them. So I knew that when I came here, I'd be able to have some people ask for me if they were working, but that's not enough. So Glenn put me in touch with some contractors here. And one of them was named Sid Sharp. He was a very, very big record date guy. In those days, there was so much work here that there were almost 3 different groups of people working that never did other things. Sid Sharp, big record date guy. That's all he did was record dates. Sessions for, you know, all the pop groups. And then there was another group of people that just did the television shows, and another group of people that just did motion pictures. It was quite extraordinary. So Sid Sharp is one of these guys who loves the violin also, much like my friend David Katz in England. He always appreciated good violin playing. So I got in contact with him, and I thought, I'm going to just send Sid something every time I do something in London. And I was doing a lot of BBC recitals, and I was doing TV shows. Of course, I couldn't send a video in those days, not like you can now. But I could send the soundtrack on a cassette of what I'd done. And I would send him these things every now and then. Little did I know that he's playing, he said, listen to this guy. Listen to this guy who's putting all my colleagues that he has in the record, and they're all listening to him because he's a big guy here. Listen to this guy play. He's coming here. he set me up here. When I moved here, I was like the new fast gun in town, and everyone was scared. My God, this guy's coming to play in the studios here, and they were all scared of me, and a lot of them didn't want me. And the best way they could undermine me, if they had a chance to do it would be say, yeah, he's a phenomenal violinist. Yeah, he's really great, but doesn't know how to play in the studio. Because that's a big, we've all seen people who are like that. I mean, they just can't blend. But I had those years of experience in London that taught me how to play in the studios. So I never put a foot out of place and never played a note out of place. I didn't even, when I tuned the violin, that was it. You didn't even hear me warm my fingers up. Nobody heard me play except when I got up to play solo, which I did many times in the beginning when I moved here. So little by little, I established myself without having to do it by noodling.
Exactly.
So anyway, the most important thing is that I learned the etiquette, studio etiquette, which is what actually saved me here, because they couldn't say I wasn't capable of playing in the studios, even though I was a great violinist. So little by little, I was accepted here, and then became concertmaster in many things. So now, the interesting part about studios is when I was growing up, my father, he loved to listen to an easy music station called WTFM. I remember it. And they used to play a lot of Percy Faith, Frank Shaxfield, Ronnie Aldrich, Mantovani, all that kind of music, which is really well crafted, well played music. We call it elevated elevator music. Now elevator music. But in those days, it was a lot of Percy Faith, particularly. He had some great arrangements and a very big success in selling records. And my father loved that kind of music. You know, the famous pieces like A Summer Place, or you know, some theme music from some big film, Love is a Many Splendid Thing, blah, blah, blah. And my father would say to me, because I'd be listening to this with him, "Did you hear that violin solo? Did you hear that guy play? That guy can play anything. You put a piece of music in front of him he's never seen before, and he'd be able to play it perfectly just one time." And I thought to myself, wow, there are people that can do that. He said, these guys could be in any orchestra they want, but they didn't want to be in an orchestra. They just wanted to be freelance and do what they wanted to do. It's called studio musicians. So that was in the back of my mind, and little did I know that I would come to fruition and be one of those guys, studio musician who can do all that stuff, which is, you know, it's a skill set. It's not for everybody, and working freelance is also not for everybody because there's no steady paycheck. So you have to be prepared for times where you're not going to be working at all, and then times you'll be so busy you don't know you want to clone yourself. I think my biggest advantage that happened to me here in Los Angeles was the formation of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra. That in 1990,
you were concertmaster of the Bowl Orchestra for
the whole time that the whole time Malcherry was there. 16 years, actually 18 years, because I stayed on a couple of years after that. But John Malcherry, was a magnificently talented conductor, and they reformed the orchestra of the Hollywood Bowl Symphony, which was from the 1950s. And under the auspices of the LA Phil, they reformed it to take the pressure off of the Los Angeles Philharmonic in the summertime from playing pops things. So the LA Phil could concentrate on Tuesday and Thursday concerts and worry about that, and we take every weekend and do the pops. We became so popular doing that. And for me, it was playing music from the movies and shows. And I have a great respect for this music. I don't look down my nose at it at all. It's well-crafted music. What you're expected to play on the violin is written for the violin well, and it reflects what a violin should be used for. I mean, one of my big dreads is when I do a film score and there's a Viatoric stuff where we're playing behind the bridge and scratching, and, you know, banging colenos, and it's not doing musical things that the violin is represented. But anyway, so in the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, this was playing all that kind of music that I really enjoyed playing. And we had a 5 CD a year contract with Philips. So for the first 5 years, we were putting out so many CDs. It was backwards, actually. I mean, normally an orchestra establishes itself by its performances, and then because they played the repertoire, then they record it. We did the opposite. We went in there, sight reading the music to record, and then we're playing it in the summertime.
Yeah. But okay, so again, you're this young student who is just gotten his master's from USC or Juilliard, but you wanna play in the studios. Where do they start?
Okay, getting the connections and getting into the studio itself is another story. That's a whole machine of social networking, I believe. Nowadays, it's a lot easier than it was because you have all the advantages of Facebook friends and getting in contact with people a little easier than it was when you just had a telephone number. You cold call somebody, which is very difficult to do, or send it a snail mail or something, which they may not even open. You'll never know whether they saw it or not. So it is a little easier making contacts now, but I'm approached by a lot of people. And the problem with the business at the moment is that it's not healthy. Not only are we crippled by this pandemic, which has completely shut down all productions of movies and television shows, so there's no product that we're going to be putting the music to. But even before that happened, the market became very, very globalized. And what I mean by that is that it used to be a center like London, New York, Los Angeles, the big major three places to record movies. That was in the 1970s and 80s. That changed drastically with the internet and the capability of recording over what they used to call EdNet in the 90s. Now it's something else. Be live in the studio, and I'm doing it all the time now, sending it to somebody. The advantage to that is that they don't have to worry about paying to go somewhere. You know, it's not quite the same as being in the room. So let's say they do want to go. Well, they found that Bratislava and Prague and Moscow and a lot of Eastern European cities have a much cheaper rate to pay the musicians and not have to worry about paying the residual. We have what's known as a secondary markets payment here, which is paid to musicians who work on a union-scored film, which gives us a share of the gross profits, adjusted gross profits. Or is it net? I don't even know. It's not a lot of money what we get compared to what they get, but it's a lot of money to us because if you multiply times the number of films you do, it's a considerable amount of money. But the important thing is that we had a good base of doing a lot of movies here. I would average about 60 movies a year in the beginning when I stopped work. And as it became, and London was always competition, I have to say. London came out with a buyout rate, which was more money up front for the movie studios to pay, but then they didn't have to worry about paying us forever after.
So no residuals, yeah.
So people would go to London, and then London had their own fears. They were threatened by Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland, who had offered musicians at a slave labor rate.
Yeah.
And so they were threatened by that. And that's how the market became so diffused, where people were able to go and record the movie somewhere else. It wasn't a union requirement. If the movie wasn't made under union rules, they could just go wherever they want to go. So we lost a lot of work there. So the business is not as healthy as it was when I entered it 35 years ago. And I would venture to say that, of course, the pandemic has made things drastically.
Made it impossible, yeah. Yeah.
So it's not a very rosy picture I would paint for somebody who wants to come into the studio. Also, as I said, it's a protected area where there's a group of people that are doing it, and that's all they do. So the more people that come in, the more chance of them not being called for something. Unless if you're in a prominent position, I'm fortunate enough to be one of those people where I know I'll be asked for or requested. It's a bit of security if you can call it security, not knowing when you're going to do something. But knowing that if there is something, you'd probably be called for it. But in the beginning stages, it's not the case at all. And so you have to have a financial security that you're not going to be sitting there fretting that this is the only way you can earn money because you may get called or even frequently called. Also, as I said, there was a misconception that playing in the studios is playing hold notes all the time. I have a thick file, a music cabinet there, of cues that I take home from a session where I've had difficulty sight reading doing it. I said, okay, somebody comes to play for me, and they want to show me how good they are, And then I take a cue out like this and say, look, I want you to look at this for about a minute, and then I want you to play it. And here's the tempo. And, you know, most of them are like deer in the headlights because they don't expect that at all to be playing in the studios.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
You have to have a good command of certain things. Also, you have to have, we're doing a lot of animated stuff. Like right now we're working on these Tiny Toons, Animaniacs, which was a series that we did 30 years ago that got resuscitated again. And playing this cartoon music is the original god of compositional cartoon music is Carl Stalling. You know that from all the Warner Brothers cartoons in the 1950s.
Wow.
Fantastic. You know, falling down the stairs is always a xylophone or a piano glist. Blinking eyes. Yeah. But the violin parts are very challenging, and you've got to have a really good mastery of chromatic scales and what I call a diminished seventh scale or an octatonic scale, which is the one where it's a whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. It's just da 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 da. It's one of those scales that you're not used to playing, and you have to play them. You know, you have to know how to do it.
Uh-huh.
So
that's so Flesh was really helpful.
Well, Flesh was helpful in the chromatic scale. I don't know if that, and that was something I had to learn. But it's based on a diminished seventh arpeggio. So every other note is a note of the diminished seventh. So on the D octatonic scale would be D, E, F natural, G, A flat, B flats. You know what I'm saying? Da 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 da. Yeah. And then the enharmonics come into it where you screw with your head if you're playing a C flat or a B natural. And of course, to a violinist, that makes a difference in the fingering.
Yeah.
D flat, you think of you're going to play with your second finger, and the B natural, you're going to play with your first finger on the A string, right?
Wow.
And you mentioned that earlier, and I said that's an art for the copyist to be able to enharmonically write something that's violinistic for us. Mm-hmm. But many times, I remember with the Hollywood Bowl one time, we were playing a piece called "It Might As Well Be Spring." It was from Rodgers and Hammerstein show. Beautiful. And it was Julian Sykes, who was a great singer. I don't know if you know who he is, but he was a Broadway guy. And he was singing this song, and they had it written in G flat for us. And these runs were it was just so complicated. I said to the copyist, because they have a copyist on staff there, I said, do you think you could possibly input this and change this section to F sharp major for us? And he said, yeah, sure. Did it instantly readable.
Wow.
Because the enharmonics were just made our fingering sensible. Uh-huh. I mean, it's just one of those things where violinistically you have to be very flexible. You understand it, you have to make these changes. But sometimes if somebody writes an E flat going to an F sharp, you're not going to play it quite as well as you play an E flat going to a G flat.
Yeah.
It'd be more logical in your head, as D sharp going to G flat would not work for you, right? D sharp to G flat, G sharp to F sharp works. Now, on the violin, we play intonation-wise. It's true. We do play an F sharp differently than a G flat. That's just our, yeah. But when you're sight reading something and playing, and it goes by quickly enough, it won't make a difference. That minor adjustment of the F sharp or the G flat. We're playing F sharp higher than a G flat, right? But if you're playing it in the passage, it may not make a difference.
Wow.
But
well,
it make a difference mentally when we're setting up our hand and the fingering.
Wow. Well, Bruce, I would just love to sit here and continue talking.
I know.
About C sharps and D flats and, and all of this. But it has been just a pleasure to hear of your journey. This is really remarkable.
Yeah, I would just say thank you for the opportunity. And I just want to say to anybody out there that is considering or wants to know that there is a life in the studios. There definitely is, but I'm saying it's a little more difficult nowadays because of the dearth of work and the fact that there's a larger pool of people that want to be doing it, and getting into something like that is more difficult because people are protected of their positions in the actual studio world. So it's a long slog, and it's not something that's going to be easy to do. But it's a rewarding career if you like living on the edge, being terrified every time you come into play something you've never seen before.
Being on the edge,
Well, do it.
worrying about playing that G flat. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, sir. Thank you so very, very much.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for the wonderful questions and the patience for listening to the answers.
No. It's my pleasure, our pleasure. Thanks,
Great.
Bruce.